Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I had the pleasure of sitting beside Liz at lunch today, and she doesn't realize it, but she's been in my life for about 5 years now. One of my colleagues introduced me to her in 2011 as she became the subject for an exit test in a RIT course. So your article was used by our students, and I have never stopped reading her since. We have had the pleasure, many of us, of using your articles in our class because they're so relevant to what our students do today. I will admit, last night I just finished your book, and it was wonderful, if not tragic for me. Several people have said it's hilarious, and I'm wondering what my life perspective is doing wrong on that one. But it is wonderful, and I would encourage you to read it, as it's a very human, if not always happy tale. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to everyone here today.
Well, thank you, Jess, and thank you, Roy. Thank you guys all for coming today. I really appreciate it. I spent 8 months of the last year at U of T on a sabbatical, and I was in rooms like this often, sometimes watching friends be playing on somebody's laptop in front of me, which I always enjoyed very much. It was like being back in university, although there was no friends and there was no laptop. When I was in university a very, very long time ago at Ryerson, which was then a Polytechnic Institute and is now a full-fledged university. So I've been grandfathered as a university graduate, but I'll get to that in a minute. It's a total pleasure to be here today. I'm, as Jess was saying, I'm a journalist for the Globe and Mail and have been for longer than many of you have been alive. I'm trying not to think about that right now because it's a bit horrifying. And I'm also a novelist. I've written one novel, hoping I will write more novels. I'm a writer. And I've always been a writer ever since I was very young in primary school. Some of you might recoil in horror at the word writer, but some of you might actually want to be writers. Is there anybody in this room who wants to be a writer? Don't be ashamed. Yeah? Okay, good. That's good. Is anybody whose parents are horrified at the idea that you want to be a writer? Yeah? Okay. Because mine were. I think maybe my dad, when I told him I wanted to go to journalism school, he was a little bit beside himself. I could have said I wanted to drive a clown car or be a used car salesman or something, or done something totally reputable like run a brothel, and that would have been more impressive to him than if I had been a journalist. For an immigrant, I think the idea of somebody trying to make their living as a writer, it seemed perilous at best. Even though he loved books, our house was filled with books. Book writing, and especially journalism, is something other people did. And as I say, maybe your parents feel the same way, that if you guys were going to be writers, it would be like setting fire to a big pile of money. And yeah, that's partly true. I won't deny it. But I'm not here today to fill you with fear about the idea of being a writer. I'm here to speak in defense of being a writer, because it is a noble and ancient profession. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life as a journalist, and I'm going to then talk a little bit about novel writing, and I'm going to read an excerpt from the very pink novel I wrote, not pink inside. I said to my publisher when she showed me this cover, I was like, that is really, really awesome. It's beautiful. No dude on earth is going to buy it. But they have. There have been many men, I've been amazed, who actually have brave souls who've gone out and bought it, which I'm pleased to see. So, and then we're going to finish in the last little while with a question and answer. So please feel free to ask me anything at all about anything I talk about or journalism in general, or writing in general, or novels, or anything at all. Don't ask me about hockey, because I don't know anything about hockey, but we can talk about the Blue Jays if you want. Let's talk about writing for a few minutes. So, Farley Mowat, who I think spoke here once, the late great Farley Mowat, once said that the only pleasure in writing lies in its cessation. And he wrote more than 40 books, so I think maybe he was just a little bit full of it. And when Dorothy Parker, the great humorist, novelist, short story writer, journalist, was asked if she liked writing, she scoffed, probably had a little sip of her martini too, and she said, "I like having written," which is pretty much what I think any writer will tell you. The act itself of writing can be very painful and laborious, and sometimes wonderful, sometimes filled with these joyful and uplifting moments. But it is also work, and it sometimes feels quite painful while we're doing it. And so why do we do it? Why do we write? Why do we write books? Why do we write newspaper articles? Why are some of us journalists? Well, I'll start with journalism. And I would say that the reason that we become journalists, or that those of us who are journalists love it, I'll paraphrase Winston Churchill when he talked about democracy. And he said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms of government. And journalism's a bit like that. It's the worst job in the world, except for all the other jobs. So it is actually, I think, in many ways, the best job in the world. And here you'll say, "But wait, didn't I see Donald Trump say CNN sucks on TV?" And various people complaining about the lamestream media. Yeah, it is going through convulsion right now. Journalism is, and the Western world. But that does not mean that it's going to be short-lived, that it's going to go away anytime soon. I think it's as vibrant as ever, except that it will change form, is what my feeling is. I work for a newspaper. It probably seems quaint to any of you. Do any of you actually get your news from a newspaper? A paper. Oh, okay. Does anybody under the age of 40 get their news from a newspaper? Okay, a few of you. Okay, interesting. I had to show my daughter, who's 10, the other day, how to actually fold a newspaper. And she was sort of sitting there with it like this. It was like a crazy Marx Brothers moment where it was going everywhere. And I had to show her to snap it open and fold it into quarters. But even if you don't kill trees 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, in order for you to get your news, even if it doesn't arrive at your door that way, I don't think journalism's going anywhere. It just might not arrive in that particular form. So what form will it arise in? Well, we're seeing some of it now. We're seeing a variety of different ways of telling stories and of presenting information in interesting ways, in ways that are useful to you, who get your news often on your phone, and for whom social media is as natural as breathing. I know the phrase digital natives maybe drives people a bit crazy, but that is the generation you live in. I still remember actually typing out my essays on an old Selectric typewriter, which none of you, thank God, will ever have to do. So now you see Vice, BuzzFeed, Vox, some of these other podcasts. So other ways of delivering what is essentially still the same thing, which is news, which is stories, which is information that you can use and that you want to share with people. The Globe, the newspaper I work for, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, are all finding ways to monetize themselves through what's called a paywall, which means essentially that you get a few free articles. Well, in the case of the Wall Street Journal, you get none. That's Rupert Murdoch for you. and then once you hit the limit of your articles, you pay for the rest. So we have to find a way, obviously, to pay for the services that we journalists deliver. Toronto Star, you may have heard, has a new and unique way of raising capital, which is they're starting to sell coffee. They will bring ground bags of coffee to your house with the Toronto Star in the morning. It's called Headline Coffee. It's kind of a stupid name, but there you go. If they start rivaling Starbucks, I think the rest of us will absolutely be following right after them. So why won't journalism die? Well, I think it is because people need information and stories. I think information and stories are the currency of our human marketplace. And although we're in a pickle as far as getting people to pay for things, it's true. We have not, and we've seen a shrinkage in the size of newsrooms across North America over the past 20 years by like probably 40% or more. We've seen newspapers close down. You're still lucky to have your own local newspaper. We've seen lots of newspapers close down, especially local ones, which is going to be a huge problem, I think, actually for democracy. In fact, we have the Canadian government has struck a committee going across the country to listen to people talking about what the death of local news and the future of the news media will mean for the country and for democracy. Because if you're living in a little town, let's say you're in Belleville, and you would have had a paper that was 150 years old, and for 150 years had been covering local politics and had been sending a reporter, probably a very young reporter, who hoped one day to go work for the CBC or something. But a young reporter would have gone to the council meetings every single day, and it's boring, but things would have risen there. You know, corruption, the quality of the water, zoning bylaws, political deal making that shouldn't have been going on. So when this kind of thing dies, nobody covers it because it's not as exciting, unfortunately, as Kim Kardashian or some of the other, or Ken Bone, or some of the other things that we become obsessed with very quickly and are fleeting. There's still a lot of superb journalism being made. If you are all watching the American election, anybody watching, keeping an eye on the American election? Okay, some of you might have heard stories about Donald Trump and his particularly strange relationship with women. Some of you may have heard about his strange relationship to his taxes, his non-relationship to taxes. Those are stories that were broken by newspapers, by the Washington Post, by the New York Times, by the Wall Street Journal, by the Guardian in Britain, and BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed's been doing amazing work. In fact, CNN hired the political editor of BuzzFeed and his whole team to go work for them because they were doing such amazing work. This is how the old media and the new, CNN's not even that old, but how they come together and grow for the future, I think. So my biography, I'll just quickly tell you, I was born and raised in Toronto. As I said, my father had, although we got the Toronto Star every day, I don't think he thought terribly highly of journalists. I went to Ryerson, then a Polytechnic Institute. So my degree is not actually a BA, but a BAAJ, BAJ, Bachelor of Applied Arts in Journalism. I immediately, on leaving university, got a full-time job, which is unheard of these days, at the Globe and Mail. I started as a copy editor. And, it really was wonderful to be able to have that kind of freedom and liberty, and they let you do pretty much whatever you wanted. This is unfortunately after the days of, cigarettes had gone the way of nobody was smoking in the newsroom, nobody was drinking in the newsroom, but it was still a huge amount of fun. And you will, I'm embarrassed to tell you all this, but you can feel free to laugh. One of the first things I did at the Globe, when I was 27, they asked me to write a column. The first column actually appeared on my 27th birthday, and the column was called Under 30. Yes, I was supposed to explain what was then Generation X on Generation X. We were the millennials of our day, let me tell you, it was a long time ago, but we went through many of the same things, and I was supposed to explain young people to the aging readers of the Globe and Mail. We're still doing the exact same thing today. It was very embarrassing. And I wrote about very stupid things, but also some very interesting things in feminism, pot legalization, the exact same things I'm writing about today. Also, why Ren and Stimpy was the best show ever, which I, thank you, Ren and Stimpy fans. Excellent, good to hear. I was the books editor of the Globe and Mail, I was a publishing reporter, I was a feature writer. I left briefly to go to a magazine called Elm Street. I ran a magazine called Elm Street, which is late and not very lamented by many people. And then I went back to the Globe and Mail, and my husband and I were reporters for the Globe in Los Angeles for 3 years. I came back, I was the arts editor of the Globe, and then we moved to London, and we were reporters in the London Bureau. So he covered all of Europe, I covered the UK for 8 years, which was extraordinary. And what was extraordinary about it, and this is what makes journalism the best job ever, and if you want in Q&As, we can talk a little bit about, whether that is still the case and whether any of you want to go into it. It introduces you to people and brings you to places you would never, ever get to go otherwise. I had a really wealthy friend, not really wealthy, he was pretty wealthy in London, who certainly was worth like 20 times more than I will ever be worth. And I told him I was doing some story, or I was going to ask God or something to cover the racing. He said, I don't understand why you get to go everywhere and do all these things. And things he did not have access to. And I said, well, that's what journalism does for you. It doesn't pay very well, but it means you get to do something very cool every single day. So I met some of the most extraordinary people. Every day brought something new. And the other thing is, if you're at all curious, and if you're not curious, you shouldn't be a journalist. It's a job where you get paid for being nosy. I cannot think of another job in the world. You get paid if you're a nosy person, if you like gossiping, if you like knowing about other people's business. It is the best job in the world because they pay you to do this. Sometimes I would find myself at a dinner party and I would be talking to somebody and I realized, I would have asked them 30 questions and they would say things like, you're giving me the 3rd degree here. That's too many questions. And I'd say, oh, okay, I'm sorry. I have to turn off my work brain and stop grilling them about whatever was happening. So every day I would go out, let's say when we were in London, and meet the most extraordinary people. I'll just tell you quickly about some of them. I accompanied a bunch of Canadian war veterans of the Second World War to the Netherlands in 2010, the 65th anniversary of the, is that right? Yeah, of the liberation of Holland. So these soldiers had been there, they'd all been very young men. The Dutch had greeted them as conquering heroes when they come, and I got to go back with them. And it was really amazing to see because they were in their mid-80s, and a lot of them were very, very emotional when we got there, and they told me stories about the friends they lost. And then we got to meet all these young high school students, because in Holland, what they do is the high school students look after the international war graves, and each high school is put in charge of a war grave. So there'll be Allied soldiers who died in the Netherlands during the liberation, and the graves are stunningly beautiful. They're kept so lovingly, and all Dutch high school students learn about this. And being there with the veterans was just fantastic. I mean, on one hand, they're these kind of salty old guys who've known each other for 65 years, and another, they were, weeping openly about things that happened 65 years before. I also met in the bunker where Churchill and his war cabinet gathered in the Second World War. I met a woman who'd been Churchill's secretary, and another woman who'd been Bomber Harris's secretary, and got to talk to them about what it was like to be in the bunker, underneath Westminster in London as the bombs were falling during the Blitz. And the interesting thing with that is they both said that they were the best years of their lives. I said, you must have been terrified. And they said, I'm not going to do the English accent. I said, no, it was fantastic. It was the best years of my life. So exciting. All the young men in uniform, they just loved it. I got to accompany a Canadian arborist who worked in Britain, cataloging all the ancient trees of Britain. I followed him around for a day. It was like being with Gandalf. It was quite amazing. I interviewed a woman who studied the decline in public washrooms. Why are there not enough public washrooms anymore? To me, this is a fascinating question. And she was an academic who was studying this. And she also gave me one of my favorite phrases of all time, which is the bladder's leash, which is how far you can go when you leave your house before you go have to pee. The bladder's leash, feel free to use it. I interviewed, racehorse trainers and opera singers and bus drivers, but mainly I got to talk to just normal people. And the gift every day of having people trust you with their stories. And sometimes I would sit back and think about it, I think I just went up to that stranger and asked them to talk to me and tell me some deep secret that I would then publish for the world, and they would do it. I mean, it's really a wonderful, sacred gift and a trust that you get from people, and it's your job, and you get paid to do it. Not very much. I'll keep coming back to this. Not very much. You get paid, but the job itself is quite wonderful. But then at some point, journalism becomes, it's enough for many people, but for some people it's not. And you want to go beyond the truth and start making things up. And I know you're thinking, don't journalists just make things up anyway? Well, no, we try not to. But if you want to actually make things up and find the truth behind the truth or reveal your own truth, you can become a novelist. So lots of journalists have become novelists. Charles Dickens wrote parliamentary sketches before he became a successful novelist. And Ernest Hemingway, of course, worked for the Toronto Star and other newspapers and magazines. And more recently, I don't know if any of you have read Girl on the Train. Have you read Girl on the Train? Yeah? Okay. Hugely best-selling book. And she was a financial journalist, Paula Hawkins. Linwood Barclay, also hugely best-selling thriller writer now, and used to work for the Toronto Star. So I think a lot of people feel, the straitjacket of writing down other people's words verbatim every day, or pretty much verbatim, and just putting them out there. And you feel like, I have another story in me that I can tell. Because sometimes you would go to a press conference or something. I'll give you a very quick story. I, in London, had to go interview, Gordon Brown was then the Prime Minister. And whenever there was a G8 or G20 summit, he would call in a certain number of journalists to 10 Downing Street, and he would tell you some boring stories about tariffs or something. So I was one of them, and went with a few other journalists, and he was giving us some, I'm sure, very worthwhile facts and figures about the British trade deficit or something. And I looked and I noticed that his fingernails were chewed well below the quick. He had obviously been gnawing on his nails forever, probably. But I thought, that's so fascinating. The British Prime Minister can't stop chewing his fingernails. And that's the thing I wanted to write about the next day. But, can't write that in the Globe and Mail. Can't write. British Prime Minister has some anxiety problem that I really understand. I wonder what it is. But if you write a novel, you can do that. So this leads me to why I thought that I would write a novel myself. Now you have to understand, I was one of those kids who was obsessed with reading. It drove people around me crazy. I would read and walk into lampposts. I would read in the car. I'd read at the dinner table, and it would drive my parents crazy. And then I had this life in books at the newspaper. I was the books editor, I was the publishing reporter. I interviewed writers constantly. And writing seemed to me a thing like brain surgery or being an astronaut. That's not something I could do. I could never write a novel. It's alchemy. It's some crazy thing you have to be like just a genius to do. And then one day, I don't even know what made me think I would try it, but I'm going to try it. What's the worst that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? I waste a lot of hours of my life, but I probably would have just spent them watching old episodes of General Hospital on YouTube. Anyway, so why not try to write a novel instead? So I did. And the seed for this novel, which is called Based on a True Story, it's a novel about an alcoholic and drug-addicted British actress who's sort of down on her luck. She's in midlife, and she has become unemployable because she's made a spectacle of herself on so many movie and television sets. And she has had a surprise, a little bit of late in life success with her memoir, which is called Based on a True Story. It's all very meta, but her memoir is filled with lies, which she realizes, and she hopes that nobody else knows. And she becomes fixated on this idea that this man from her past is going to write another book setting a record straight and telling the truth about their life together, which she doesn't want anyone to know. So she enlists the help of this kind of, also at loose ends, young American journalist who's living in London and who is having a bit of success but not very much, and who, well, I won't tell you what happens because I'm going to read that chapter, but the two of them end up together on a road trip to the United States. So, and where mayhem ensues. It's a bit like Lucy and Ethel, for those of you who remember, except with a lot more drinking. I like to say also that it's like Thelma and Louise with less death and more booze. And nobody drives off a cliff at the end, which is good. I'm very happy about. So, the many things made me want to write about it. I've always been fascinated with like celebrity memoirs, and not just celebrity memoirs, but memoirs of famous people who, you know, whether they're writers or politicians or whatever, because it always seemed to me they never could, as much as you think you know yourself, as much as you're trying to be honest with yourself, as much as you go out and say, this is my raw, honest heart on the page here, it's my belief that nobody ever really can know themselves entirely, and nor can you really entirely spill yourself on the pages of a memoir or an autobiography. You can try to, and I think you can get close. There's always going to be the space between the mask and the face that we don't get to see. And I thought about this for a long time, and then in 1996 I went and interviewed a woman, some of you might know, some of you who are a little bit older will know, named Marianne Faithfull. So Marianne Faithfull is this fantastic figure from the 1960s London. She is most famous, unfortunately, even to this day, for being Mick Jagger's girlfriend for a long time, but she's a fantastic singer in her own right, and an interpreter of cabaret songs, and writer and actress. Anyway, she had written this memoir in 1996 called Faithful, and I went to, the other thing she's mostly famous for is being a huge drug addict and alcoholic. That's the thing she's actually probably most famous for. And she was homeless for a year in London because she was on heroin the whole time. Anyway, I went to interview her, and she's just this sort of over-the-top, wonderful figure, very dramatic. And she had written this book called Faithful, this memoir. I expected to get the same story from her you get from everybody who writes a memoir, which is, oh yeah, this is my heart and soul on the page. And instead she said, it's the Mick and Keith story. That's what the publisher wanted. It has nothing to do with me. Nothing at all, darling. And I thought, oh, that was fascinating. That she had admitted that this book, which actually is a really good book, if you ever get a chance to read it, was just something she'd written for money and didn't really have anything to do with her life at all. And the other great thing that happened was she was quite drunk when I interviewed her. And she'd just come back from lunch, and she had this terrible raging toothache, and the publicist, who's now my publisher actually, publicist was on the phone in this giant um, majestic hotel suite with a dentist trying to get her some antibiotics to arrange this toothache and to help the toothache. And the publicist called across the room to Marianne Faithfull. Marianne, the dentist wants to know if there's any drugs you're allergic to. And Marianne Faithfull said, oh no, darling, there's no drug I'm allergic to. And at this point I would know, which I just lost. So I left it there and I was like totally in love with Marianne Faithfull. And the seed for this got planted in my head about the lies we tell ourselves and the lies we tell other people and how those things can never, and maybe never should actually, be fitted together. Maybe like complete honesty is a myth or an unattainable goal. Anyway, I'm going to read you a little bit based on a true story. Just a very, 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 very short bit, which is the first chapter, because I want to just talk about a few other things before we get to the questions. So it begins with Augusta being kicked out of rehab, not for the first time. Augusta, is the name of the main character, the actress who's down on her luck. It was not the first time she'd been asked to leave a clinic. Augusta huddled into her coat as the wind cut across the porch. The nurse who'd come to say goodbye remained inside, as if afraid to leave the safety of the foyer. One hand held out in farewell, and the other on the handle of the door. The paint was peeling down the side, Augusta noticed. The other clinics had been much smarter than this. She took the outstretched hands, their cold fingers meeting. This nurse, Jennifer, had been her sole friend and ally over one long week, which should have been two. "We'll not see you here again," Jennifer said. "No," said Augusta. "You'll not see me here again." "Well," said the nurse, "you know you can always ring me any time if you do feel yourself slipping. My mobile's on there." And she fished a card from the pocket of her blue tunic. Augusta looked at it and realized with some surprise that the nurse she'd been calling Jennifer was in fact named Claudia. The door inched shut, and Claudia turned back inside to tend the drunks and wastrels who knew how to obey rules. Augusta watched her go. She really should have made more of an effort to hide the pills, but who knew that her roommate would be such a quisling? She walked to the curb, where a minicab sat idling. Someone had drawn a penis in the dirt on its side, elephantine testicles dangling below. "My chariot," she said. A copy of the local newspaper tumbled along the pavement and wrapped itself around her ankle. "Walthamstow Shopping Centre to celebrate 25 years," read the headline on the front page. Walthamstow, boil on the neck of London, where she'd begun, and, against all her best efforts, where she had washed up. She kicked the newspaper aside and reached for the door of the minicab. Alma Partridge sat in the back, wrapped in an ancient fur as stiff as a sarcophagus. Augusta slid in beside her, inhaling the mingled smells of her old friend's musty coat and the driver's luncheon kebab. Alma gave him an address in Camden, and he pulled out into the traffic. After a moment, Alma placed a dry and papery hand over Augusta's. "You look well, my dear. How's the sanatorium?" Augusta closed her eyes against the pain of the last afternoon light. "It was fine. Fewer meetings than usual, thank Christ. But if you really want to know, a bit on the cheap side. Thin gruel." She felt Alma's hand withdraw. "Perhaps if you'd stayed the course, it would have proved more useful." Despite herself, Augusta laughed. "You have a positively maternal gift for the barb, Alma. How I missed that when I was inside. All they spoke about was vulnerability and forgiveness and reaching out and recovering one's footing. Not such bad things," Alma said. "And journey as a verb." Alma shuddered. "That is disgraceful." With an effort, Augusta wrenched one eye open. "I'm grateful you came to collect me, darling, really. You're my dearest friend. I'm your only..." Augusta brought her hand up. The broken tip of one fingernail dangled like an unlatched gate. "I am well aware. It does not bear repeating." Each retreated to her own corner in rankled silence. "No photographers outside when I left," Augusta muttered. "I thought the rags loved this kind of filth. Fallen celebrities." Alma raised one penciled brow at the word celebrities. She said, "I believe what they're searching for is the unexpected fall." She ran a hand through her nimbus of white hair, coaxing the sparse strands higher. As the car sped south, the lights of shops and restaurants glowed in the gathering dusk. It seemed that every second window advertised a pub quiz, pitchers of draft on sale, discounted trays of shooters. So, Augusta said brightly, drink? She felt Alma stiffen next to her and reached out to clasp her friend's hand. A joke, darling. Merely a joke. That's the first short chapter of this. It's hopefully not my last novel, but we'll see. So, writing. One of the great reasons, too, that even if your parents think that being a writer is burning money, is that when you do write your book, you get to show them it. There it is. See, it's actually here. I did it. Take them into a bookstore. Like, look, there it is. So I thought I would share with some of you want to be writers. I would share with you some of the wisdom that, because I have quite seriously interviewed probably more than 200 writers over the course of 25 years. Yes, 25 years. I know, you can't believe it, can I? Really? How could I have been working for 25 years? And the funny thing is when you interview novelists, they, the same things keep being said over and over again. And you can buy big, thick books that will condense some of this wisdom for you, and some of them are actually good. But the main things seem to be read a lot and read widely. If you don't love reading, you're not going to love writing, and you're not going to have the patience for it. And widely because style changes over time. So if you read things from 50 years ago, from 80 years ago, from 200 years ago, it will sound different to your ear, and it will give you a wider sense of what the possibilities are of the language. For your own language and for your own usage and what you can do. And it's amazing when you go back and read like books that were popular, you know, say 50 years ago, John O'Hara or something, that have fallen off the curriculum. Nobody really looks at them anymore. And you see why they were popular then, and they're so stylish, or James M. Cain, something like that. They're so stylistically interesting. So it's good to not just read, I think, stuff that's come out in the past, 5 or 10 years. One of my favorite writers of all time is Hilary Mantel, the novelist, most famous for her Booker Prize-winning novels about Thomas Cromwell, Bring Up the Bodies and Wolf Hall. She's writing a third one. Anyway, she said, write the book that you want to read. And I know it sounds so trite, write the book you want to read, but really it's such a crucial piece of advice in that you might think that you should be writing like the great Canadian literary novel about the death of some mill town or something, but really what you want to write is about dragons, or you want to write a mystery, or you want to write a romance. Then that's what you should be writing, and you should not feel that there's this other thing over here that's more important or better for you or anything. You will, as soon as you try to write something that feels false, you'll see. You'll feel how wrong it is for you. And the flip side of that is when you find something that is right for you, you'll feel it. And you'll feel that, I'm not saying it won't be hard work, because it will, but you'll feel, it feels more like, going downhill on a nice toboggan and not trying to drag your toboggan uphill. Bum and chair, that is the thing that every single writer will tell you. There's just no other way, there's nothing around it. You have to put your bum in the chair every day, even if it's for an hour, but every day. You take weekends off or your birthday. But it has to be a job. It's not a hobby, it's a job, if you want to be successful at it. Elizabeth Gilbert said, the writer of Eat, Pray, Love, said something that I thought was really great recently in her book about creativity, which I urge you to read. She said, recognize that fear is going to come along with you. And you could say to fear, you can be in the car, but you don't get to drive. You don't get to be in the driver's seat. I know you're going to be like in my head the whole time telling me, oh, I can't do it, or nobody's going to read this, or it's useless. And that's fine. That voice will never leave. But you just have to say, acknowledge it and say, you're there, but you're not going to stop me from doing this thing that I'm doing. And I think that's a really powerful piece of advice, because our internal messaging system is often the thing that crushes us. It's usually not somebody outside saying, don't write that book. You know, people outside don't care if you write the book or not, if you spend 2 hours a night doing that instead of something else. It's the voice inside you that says you can't do this or nobody cares. So ignore the voice. Put it in a little, make it sit in the back seat. Stephen King wrote a really, I have a lot of time for Stephen King. I love Stephen King. And he wrote a great book called On Writing, which is actually probably my favorite book about writing. And he said, there's first draft with the door closed, second draft with the door open. What that means is your first draft is going to be somebody else. Anne Lamott, I think, put it more concisely, a bit more vulgarly, when she said something like, the first draft is always shit. And it is. So what Stephen King and Anne Lamott were saying was, just write, just get it on the page, just put it there, and where the real writing occurs and where the work occurs and where the joy occurs is when you rewrite. And when Stephen King says, write the second draft with the door open, means at some point in your rewriting of your book, or your story, you will want to give it to somebody else. Probably not the first draft or two, but at some point you will. You'll give it to somebody you trust, if it's a teacher, a friend, a relative, whoever, and say to them, give me an honest opinion. And then it's up to you whether you take on board those criticisms and suggestions or not. It's totally up to you. But that is, and the other thing is, learn to love rejection. There's not a writer in the world who has not had a ton of rejection. Probably I would say like every famous novel you can name has been rejected by like Lolita was, you know, one publisher wrote to Nabokov and said, you know, if you publish this, you will be the most, you know, it's too depraved even to imagine. I would be sent to jail if we published this. J.K. Rowling, I don't even know how many people she sent the first Harry Potter book to, and turned down and turned down and turned down. Rejection is part of your life. It is the rarest unicorn of a book that gets accepted, or is, you know, you read about bidding wars over first novels. They happen, but they're rarer than unicorns. And the other thing is, a couple things nobody will tell you. It's going to take much longer than you expect. Much, 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 much longer. There'll be a lot of drafts involved. There's very little money in it, unfortunately. So you have to do it for love, because it interests you, because you think it's important. Even if the only people who read it are you and your friend, or you put it online and hope somebody reads it, that's got to be enough for you. Because the giant pots at the end of the rainbow, the Gone Girls and the J.K. Rowling thing, they happen, obviously, but they're rare. Yeah. But if you love it, and if you love the writing, it's really all you need. So the great thing about being a writer is you need you don't need a degree. Some people argue you might need an MFA. I don't necessarily think you do. You don't need any tools except for a computer or even a pen and a paper. Lots of people still write longhand. You would be surprised at the number of novelists who write longhand. I think partly because it makes you think more about the words as you put them down. So you need very few tools. You need no real expertise whatsoever. You don't even need a room of one's own. Despite what Virginia Woolf said, you can do it at Starbucks. You can sit by the window all day long with one latte and do it. All you really need is love of words and of people, and you need to be curious, and you need to have a story that you want to tell. And then you'll be a writer. And that is all. I think that leaves us just enough time for questions. I hope some of you have questions about journalism or writing or anything at all. Yes?
Do you have to be a creative person to be a good journalist?
You have to be a creative person to be a good journalist, is the question. No. I would say no, you don't. Because I think the qualities for being a good journalist are you need to be able to use a telephone, which is not that hard. you can dial a number, you're kind of a journalist. My husband, who's also a journalist, always says, he drives him crazy when people ask if journalism is a profession. He's like, no, it's barely a craft. Really all you need to do is be able to talk to somebody on the phone and write it down and like condense it. You need to be very curious. You need to be skeptical. You need to have a little bit of being unafraid of talking to people and confronting people. Not necessarily confronting them. I never confront anybody. Some journalists do. I'm not a confrontational person at all. But you need to have, a radar for nonsense. You need to be able to snip those things out. You need to be able to take orders from your editor. It's a bit like being on a football team. There's a boss who tells you what to do. And the creativity, I guess, comes in with how you choose to tell the story. And the creativity is actually really important. Now that I think about it, the creativity is very important now because we can't do things the old way in journalism because it's not working. You know, we talked about this, newsprint. You need to be creative in how you tell stories. So stories being told on Instagram, stories being told through podcasts, through video, a variety of other methods, lists, video. That's where the creativity comes in. Deciding how people in 5 years are going to want stories delivered to them. So in that way, yes, journalism does need creative mind. So I take my answer back, yes. Changing it to yes. Yes?
Just piggybacking off of that idea, what do you think about the new ways in which people are getting their information delivered to them, such as in Facebook, when we have articles that are clearly tailored towards our personal interests and that are very biased being directed towards us, and people accepting such limited forms of news reporting?
Right. So there's, the question is about when you receive information that's kind of tailored towards you on, say, a social media platform, and it limits the breadth of knowledge and stories you're getting. I think this is true. Other people dispute it. I personally think it's true. I think we do live in these little echo chambers where, I can't remember his name now, he wrote a book called Filter Bubble, but it's about how online interaction essentially means that instead of getting more and more and more information, you get less and less and less and less. For reasons having to do with, for example, the algorithms of Facebook, so that they tailor things to what they think you like, so that you aren't exposed to new information. And I think it's super dangerous, actually, for two reasons. One, you don't necessarily get to understand why people have different opinions from you. You don't respect that they have different opinions. You don't engage in debate with them. And the other is that the danger of like false information, of stories that come to you that your aunt sends you. They're with like weird memes, and you're like, that's not true at all. Why? Where did you even get that from? So I think that is dangerous, and my answer to that would be to read widely and skeptically. Beyond Twitter, beyond Facebook. Just there's so much information out there. Every government has websites, every university, every think tank, all their reports on it, all their stuff. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. You can find information everywhere. Okay, way up at the back. Yeah, so London, when the pubs let out, that's a very dangerous place. The question is, did I ever have to go into any dangerous places? And I joke, but actually London is one of the scarier places, believe it or not. People are, the top deck of the buses on London when the pubs let out is a very frightening place. No, my short answer is no. I've been in riots and things like that, but no, I've never been to Afghanistan or Iraq or anything. That is not my bag. Yes.
Looking at what you said earlier about local news slowly being weeded out, and how international news corporations and social media corporations and slowly evolving the way journalism is viewed, how would you say journalism is going to
very good question, and I think it will depend on the platforms that it's delivered on and the ways in which the stories are being told will form what kind of stories we have, right? So will there be an appetite, for example, for investigative reporting? Will somebody be willing to fund this? Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, bought the Washington Post, hired a lot of people. You might think one thing about him as the owner of Amazon, and I get that, but as a newspaper owner, that's a great thing, because they've been able to do a lot of investigative reporting. Will that be available in other areas where a rich person does not own a newspaper? I don't know. I really hope so, because it is the lifeblood of democracy that you know and I know what's going on behind the scenes, and somebody does the boring stories about taxes and zoning and corruption and all these things. I look at the Bridgegate trial in New Jersey right now, which is absolutely fascinating. Somebody, dug and did lots of stories so that we would find out. And today, Governor Chris Christie has, I think, he's been subpoenaed or something. Anyway, I think there's an appetite for investigative stories well told. The question is how it is funded. So even things like some news sites are going to crowdfunding. Some investigative journalists are using crowdfunding as a way to pay for their work. Others use charitable foundations and public money, government money. So those are all hopefully viable models for the future. Yeah. Oh, okay. Can I get the last question? Yeah, quick question.
It's a super question.
Yeah.
About your book, how many drafts did you write?
Yeah.
And did you ever give up at a certain point and then get back to it?
Both excellent questions. I would say I wrote 4 or 5 major drafts and then many smaller drafts after that. And that's not much. I mean, there are novelists who go through 25 drafts of a novel. You would not believe how many times. And yes. There were many times when I thought this is just utter crud. And nobody will ever want to read it. And I think Zoe Whittle, the novelist who's on now, I'll just tell you this quick story, who's on the Gilder Short list this year for her novel Best Kind of People. She was just here. And I love the story that she's been telling about that novel, because it's on the Gilder Short list, it's on the bestseller list, and it took her so long to write, and she kept thinking that it was terrible, and her agent and her editor kept saying, it's not working. And she said she wanted to throw it away, she wanted to bury it, but she kept going back to it, and she finally got it right. And it's a lot of work, but in the end, you can have something useful.